Kat Nikolich is now going to tell us something about harbor seal vocalizations.
Thanks. All right, hi, my name is Kat. Excuse my voice. I promise I am in fact a female human. Just experiencing a cold right now. So what I want to talk to you about is the real speed dating version of some of the work I've been doing for my master's thesis down in Western Washington University. That's in Bellingham, Washington, but all of this research was done actually in Canada. So harbor seals, as you're probably aware, are one of the most common species of marine mammals in this area. The most common you'll find in the Strait of Georgia. I'm looking at their breeding behavior in particular, so the patterns of their breeding behavior. They breed during the late summer and early fall in this area. During that time, the males will produce underwater vocalizations. They will establish territories in the water, usually around where the females are hauled out, and then they'll produce these underwater vocalizations both to deter other males as well as potentially to attract females. So this harbor seal, the breeding call is called a roar. It was first described in Monterey Bay, California about 20 years ago. So I don't know how many of you actually knew that harbor seals make underwater sounds before I started talking about this, but it is still a fairly new area of research. This breeding call has been heard in a number of populations throughout the harbor seal's global range. We believe this is a call that's used to actually sort of show physical and sexual fitness to other individuals. This is what it sounds like. Okay, maybe the sound system has been turned down. I'm sorry, guys. That's okay. If you can imagine somebody breathing into a microphone, sort of like, I'm not going to do that and get the microphone wet, but that's basically what it sounds like. So it's a very diminutive call. It's a little bit hard to pick out. It's actually easier to see on a spectrogram than it is to hear in real life. Now, of course, harbor seals can't be calling all the time. Breeding calls have to be a part of their energy budget, which means that they have to be feeding, they have to be resting and doing other things. So understanding the timing of when they make these breeding calls on a daily and yearly basis can give us an idea of the environmental and biological constraints that are acting on these animals while they're calling. So we know that in harbor seals, call timing can be influenced by tide, and that has to do with hollow-out patterns, which makes sense because as the tide rises, you have more seals in the water that are potentially calling to one another. Time of day has been shown to have a difference, as well as the time of year, because they do have a discrete breeding season. They don't tend to vocalize outside of that season. So this has been shown in other populations. However, the breeding behavior and the vocal breeding behavior of harbor seals has never been studied in the Pacific Northwest, despite numerous harbor seals in this area. Something else that I think is really interesting to look at in terms of these environmental factors is anthropogenic noise. As we know, and as we've seen earlier today, anthropogenic noise does have some behavioral effect on other marine mammals, especially with regard to their vocalizations. This has not been looked at in terms of harbor seal vocalizations. So what I wanted to look at is what environmental factors, including ambient noise, affect the vocal behavior of animals in the Strait of Georgia, which is an incredibly noisy region, as you saw earlier, really heavily trafficked. Is it the time of day or the tide that I wanted to look at? As has been shown in other areas. I also wanted to look at the ambient noise level. So this is a very open-ended question. These are three things that I wanted to look at in particular. My study site was Hornby Island, chosen because it just has a really high density of harbor seals that are accessible visually from shore. So if I zoom in here, this is southern Hornby Island at a place called Heron Rocks. This is where we did our research. So we had the hydrophone positioned in the middle of the rocks that was recording continuously from June through September 2014, and then we took visual observations from a nearby site on shore. Once I had all this data collected, I started to go through, and a real brief version of my analysis, I'll show you a picture of it later, is that I went through and took 20 random days from the breeding season, and I counted the number of vocalizations that I heard in each hour of those 20 days. This is the most striking trend that I found. So this is the average number of calls per hour over time of day. The shaded areas are when it was dark. So right away you can see that these harbor seals preferred to vocalize almost exclusively at night. So of course the next question is, why would this be? So we can probably all agree that it's energetically favorable for males to call at times when they're most likely to be heard. You're not going to bother calling if nobody's around to hear you. So the first thing I wanted to look at is, does this have to do with tide? Do those 20 days that I picked just happen to be when the tide was highest and most seals are in the water at night? I had a look at our visual observations from during the day, and it turns out that we saw exactly what you would expect. So there was more seals hauled out and less seals in the water around low tide, which is indicated sort of in the middle there, and then the opposite happening at high tide. So this is what you'd expect to see. However, from our statistics, the number of calls per hour was not related to tidal height at all. So if that tidal haul-out pattern persisted overnight, we can also infer that the harbor seals were not calling more when there were more seals in the water. But of course, there's other things at play here. So another thing I wanted to look at, which unfortunately there isn't a lot of information about, is foraging patterns. So were the seals just foraging at night and therefore more active and vocalizing at night? There's not a lot of information in this area about when these animals are are foraging. We do know that harbor seals are adapted for nocturnal and diurnal foraging, and that they're opportunistic, especially in this area. Harbor seals will eat what they can, when they can, as much as they can. So it's likely that the seals are foraging both during the day and at night. I can't confirm that, and that's something that I'd really like to look at a little bit further with this. But of course, being heard doesn't just mean the number of animals that are around you. You can be in a crowded bar and there can be as many people as there are in this room, but if the music is blaring really loud, they're still not going to hear you. So one other thing that I wanted to look at was ambient noise level. We know that the seals preferred to call at night, where it was significantly statistically lower noise than there was during the day. More interestingly, the number of calls per hour, regardless of the time of day, increased as the noise level decreased. Now, of course, time of day and ambient noise level were really highly correlated, so I couldn't sort of speak to each one of these individually, but there's some suggestion that these seals are calling when there's less noise. We also know that the kind of noise that we are looking at, mostly anthropogenic vessel noise from outboard motor vessels, overlaps with the harbor seal calls out over about 1 kilohertz, so the higher component of these calls. The higher frequency component of those calls has been shown to be really important in actually conveying the dominance of a particular animal. So this important information could be masked by the boat noise. So it's possible that the males in this area are calling at night to actually avoid having the information in these calls masked by vessel noise. This is by no means conclusive evidence, but I think it's a really interesting thing to look at, considering that harbor seals in this area are doing just fine. They're obviously having no trouble reproducing, but there are areas in the world where you don't have this diel pattern of boat traffic, where you actually have equal boat traffic during the day and the night. I'd like to look at these areas, as well as areas where harbor seals are in a population decline, to see if this could actually present some sort of conservation concern. So I'll leave you with that for now. I'm happy to talk to you about this later. I'm also going to be, shameless plug, I'm taking a poster to the Marine Mammal Conference in San Francisco this December, so I may see some of you there as well. So thanks very much. I'd like to acknowledge a number of the people that made this possible, especially my collaborators at JASCO Applied Sciences, which provided all of the equipment as well as the expertise for this study. And this is a picture of me during my analysis. I'll take any questions.
Any questions for Kat?
Hi.
Front.
Yes. Yeah, so what was asked is there is a visual display on the surface, so sort of flipper slapping that's sometimes associated with these calls. And he's wondering if I had seen or if I had heard this underwater in association with the calls. The surprising answer is no. Not any more than I heard it associated with other kinds of behavior. We heard a lot of flipper slapping during the day, but it wasn't associated with those calls, which is different from what's been seen in other areas. It's usually been really highly associated. And similarly, when I was hearing a lot of the roars underwater, it was maybe 50-50 that there would be flipper slaps associated with it. There was really no correlation between them, which I found to be interesting. Yeah.
Much, Kat.